Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between podcast. I'm a clinical psychologist and medium, and here we explore life, death, consciousness, and what it all means. Today I have Jacob Cooper with me on the show. Jacob is a clinical social worker, certified Reiki master, and certified hypnotherapist who specializes in past life regression therapy. Inspired by his near-death experience and transformative encounters, he facilitates spiritual awareness and empowerment through life-changing seminars. His new book, Life After Breath, is out now. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you so much for having me on as an honored guest on your program, Amy. Thank you.
Hi, we made it to March, so now you have your March public service announcements. If you have not rated and reviewed the podcast yet, please do so. Also subscribe. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts, Instagram, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, anywhere. Also, my course is coming. It is going to begin April 19th. So that will be the first day of the course. If you are not signed up for my newsletter yet or have not put yourself on the wait list for the course, you will not hear much about it. If you are on my newsletter and wait list, you will hear a lot about it. So make sure you do that. Sign up at dramyrobbins.com. Also, please make sure you follow me on Instagram at Dr. Amy Robbins, and stay tuned for another great month full of amazing podcast episodes. I feel like, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but the content keeps getting better. So hopefully you're enjoying it, and here's to springtime. Can you start by telling us the story of your NDE? Because it's unusual in terms of how old you were when it happened.
Yeah. It's very, NDEs as it is, they're becoming more mainstream and more well-known, but, the age that I had it is not too conventional. I was the age of 3 years old. At the time, I had a highly contagious upper respiratory virus called pertussis, otherwise known as whooping cough. And I went to a playground with family friends, my babysitter at the time and my sibling. And I, due to the whooping cough, I suffocated when I was going in a playground, climbing a ladder on a slide. And, really once I lost my breath, I was able to tap into an eternal breath of the spiritual realm on the other side. But it was quite profound in the sense that I, found everything by losing all control of my body, so to speak. And, within the greatest fears that I had the greatest degree of support all around me and the knowingness that I could never be, harmed, damaged, and that I was a lot more than just my physical age of 3 years old and my body, which wasn't functioning due to the deprivation of oxygen and suffocation.
Can you take us through what happened? Because at 3, it's almost hard to imagine that you have an experience like that you remember. So how did you at the time remember all of this, or was it only sort of when you looked back? Did people recount the story for you and then you were like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened at the playground and everything came flooding back? Mm-hmm. It's just so unusual to me.
Yeah, well, as a clinical therapist, I know I have certain capital and legs to stand on when it comes to understanding trauma. And there's nothing more traumatic, at least in my experience, than suffocating and being near death. And so when you have something so profound at any age, even if it's a past life, it tends to stick with you. And so people are able to have past life memories like we see in Surviving Death of those young boys who have come very matter-of-factly and discussed their experiences. So too, even in this body, this age, that would lend itself as a possibility. But you combine the euphoria that I experienced in crossing over to the other side, combined with the suffocation, that all added up to, something that I remembered, and not just the actual event, but, surrounding events of that. I remember very little actually from my childhood. I'm no different or infancy years, but with something so profound and traumatic, it stuck with me. Now, to answer your question, there was an internalization of the experience that I really suppressed and repressed for quite some time. It wasn't until my later years, well, I was given a lexicon and a vocabulary of the experience by picking up the book by Betty Eadie, a New York Times best-selling book called Embraced by the Light. Uh, After reading that book, I had a language and a diagnosis of what I had. And so that gave me, more support, universality, and cohesion to be able to even discuss what I had, because up until that point, it just would be, fading on the surface. And sometimes like a beach ball, I'd be trying to push it down in order to just kind of fit in as I, relay within my psychosociological development after this transformative near-death experience.
So was this, do you feel like this experience shaped your life, and how in your early formative years, even if it was repressed?
Yeah, I look at it like anything else, like a double-edged sword. And certainly in my lifetime, there was a double-edged sword phenomenon with this. At one, and I talk about my book with this, there is an isolative component to it where, in a sense that I speak about in my book, where I had interdimensional communication with spirits, and I was able to see, factors and components on either side. And I understood clearly that my classmates in nursery school weren't privy to that and didn't understand that. And, that kind of took the rug under my feet, combined with, memories of waking up in the hospital bed and having a clear knowingness that no matter what I do or said at the time, people surrounding me in my life and family would not be able to understand. And I just didn't have the verbiage externally to really describe this series of events, as much near-death experiences struggle even in later years. And so the isolation component was quite challenging, as well as being more comfortable with that side than this side. I speak about this in my book, that I would often, from going to the other side, I had a clearer pathway and understanding, through, different kind of, I guess, you'd say my brain was deprived of oxygen. And so the filter between the two worlds was a lot cleaner. And so I was able to seamlessly go to the other side a lot easier. And so I was more comfortable being there than here at times. But, the emotional depth that I had, and the ability just to feel, sense, know things, that to me was in a way worth it, that I was able to view life not just from the body, but from the vantage point of the soul, which exceeded age, linear time, and limitations of the body that some of my other peers in my age group may not have had, or at least integrated.
So you talk in the book about what it was like growing up, having had this experience. And the struggles, I think, to relate to peers and also to deal with your own mental health, as you were trying to understand this. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people think near-death experience equals spiritual awakening immediately, right? And you were 3. So
Right.
It's hard to really understand what a spiritually awakened 3-year-old would look like. And it's not usually that linear, right? There's usually a lot of struggle processing the experience.
Yeah. I mean, I was certainly, early on, I was in this world, but not of this world. I was very much disconnected, throughout times, as I speak to in the book. But looking back on it from a therapist perspective, I would say definitely the unresolved and unexpressed trauma and the suppressed, repressed experience of crossing over and not being able to really express myself led to a lot of anger, defiance, and just frustration in regarding authoritative kind of figures, in a sense that, I was taken out of the conveyor belt of kind of people looking at me as an empty vessel and just looking at me at my body. And I was able to kind of see past that, where I was able to experience the soul, which was far greater. So there's a bit of almost like age dysphoria that happened that I wasn't able to express, where that led to power struggles with, at times, teachers and parents. And, I look at all my other siblings, they were perfect kids, and I was the real difficult child. And so something happened in between. We had the same meals, we had the same home, we had the same rooms, same education. But I was in it, I probably spent almost half my time in the therapist's office, versus over home. I could have probably paid a decent amount of rent there, addition to my copays. So, uh, you know, it didn't come with that as challenges. And I think that's a great point where a lot of people talk about the euphoric elements or the monopolization of the other side and all things spiritual. Um, and I say this all the time. I don't pretend to be the heaven guy or the guy who's got monopolization of the other side, but rather the guy who had this transformative experience and was able to have an awareness of how so much more is out there than what we are privy to. And it's been a daily quest to understand God and the other side each and every day and learning to ground it, spirituality with practicality kind of thing. So
how did this sort of, when you finally realized what had happened to you, how old were you at the time? I know you said you read that book.
Yeah, so I would say like in my early 20s is when I read Betty's book. It was given by actually my godmother. At the time, I was taking different yoga practices and, kind of meditating because in college, I needed a lot more inside of me to handle the challenges in front of me. I was in the lowest level of remedial courses in a community college. I had very little self-efficacy or belief system in myself, and thus I struggled with the ability to see past, being in the lowest level of remedial courses in colleges. And so from kind of engagement with different energy practices and Eastern, philosophies, as well as good mentorships in my life that I call kind of earth angels, that opened me up, where it's just this kind of like collective holistic opening that wasn't just the near-death experience, but many different factors that led to this opening. But I would say, just in terms of publicly, just in terms of giving the most confidence that this was indeed the path, was I was in a yoga seminar, and I speak about this in my book, where I was just sitting there randomly, waiting for the seminar to re-begin. And this random person came up to me and said, "You have a big auric field, and I see," and she just stopped for a moment. She said that, "I see you speaking in front of a lot of people. You're going to be a well-known healer one day. Just watch. Give it 10, 15 years, I guarantee you." And at the time, I was kicked out of my house temporarily. I was living with my grandparents, and I thought there was nothing there. And so there's a lot of allegorical references that I learned from my near-death experience, just in terms of entrusting the path inside of you to be able to mitigate and manage the challenges in front of you. And I think that's a universal principle and one of the greater gifts of my NDE and subsequent transformative experiences.
So can you speak a little bit to some of your other transformative experiences? Because in the book, you describe that you have these out-of-body experiences.
Yeah. Which to me, that was almost even more profound, because near-death experience was a great experience, but when you have an NDE, usually in near-death experiencers, researchers will tell you it takes 20 to 30 years to kind of externalize the experience and to be able to find ways to integrate it. Where the out-of-body experience, I'm not sure regarding time frame, but it was like an experience that I was able to have, an awakening, not of the other side, but of this planet, in a sense that literally I woke up one day, around this time when I was practicing all these modalities, and I was literally above my body, and I had no choice. I had to go to classes, but I would walk in the hallway and literally be looking down on myself. It was quite familiar, but at the same time, my left brain is like, all right, get back into your body. Like, it's kind of a bit of anxiety, and just didn't know what to make of it or why it was happening. But I experienced a profound experience out of all places in a synagogue, which I speak about in my book, was not the ideal place where I envision enlightenment. It was quite contrary and a little bit diametrically opposite to my experience with the other side. But, I was literally out of my body, and I flew out of my body, and I was able to be conscious of, the egocentrism that people had, or how they were just very separate and very top heavy in their own, thoughts and, stuff like that. And they were thinking, but they weren't feeling. And, there's a lot of separation that they didn't recognize about. And so I was able to see the cohesive strand of energy connecting, all participants in the room. And I almost had to get kicked out of the synagogue. If not, I might have been asked to leave, because I was laughing so hard at just the amnesia that people have, where how they take themselves so seriously and how limited their awareness is of this body, without understanding of the interconnected parts and agents of this symmetry that we're all a part of. And so that to me, I think people can understand and conceptualize with the left brain, infinite, we are one, but you can't because you're using the left brain, which is linear. And to understand these nonlinear experiences, it's usually best by direct experiential reality. And so, I'd read all these things and you just kind of one ear out the other, but to see it in front of you was a whole other ballgame.
So explain to me what that looked like exactly. Like, can you take yourself out of your body, or it just spontaneously happens?
Well, essentially, and I know there's different terminologies for this. I mean, some would just call like Kundalini awakening. But I mean, at the time, I'm just sitting in my chair and I'm feeling this massive hose of fire in my back, and just this intense fire in my back and my lower back, and it was just blowing up. And my heart was, to best describe it, it felt like an ocean. Like literally I would touch it and it would just feel like I was putting my hands in a body of water. It was just insane. And then I'd feel spinning wheel of energy, as well as a subtly opening up eyeball, my third eye, which would literally, I'd feel like very slowly blinking on and off, eyeballs, if like I was blinking my eyes. And it would grow a lot stronger when I put my, mind's eye there. And so I had all this experience combined with coolness in the back of my head. And so a lot of the understanding was just in terms of getting in touch with different elements. And then literally I felt myself like wings, like by my collarbone and shoulder. And I just literally just lifted, again out of my body in that chair. And so this intense experience allowed me to really take ride on an animal totem that I had. And I was flying literally over the synagogue, with my animal totem. And I didn't do a Timothy Leary trip or LSD. For those who know me, I'm a very clean guy. I don't drink, don't smoke. I'm an exercise guy. I'm a grounded Taurus. So, that just told me that there's just so much more inside of us, and it could happen, at any time, as long as we're able to be open to, energetic awakenings, and it happens when we're ready, for these experiences. But I think the second that we're able to identify with ourselves with more than a body and a soul, that would lend itself to be able to have these direct experiences of expansive consciousness.
So does that still happen to you, or was this sort of a 1 or 2 off time and
Yeah.
it doesn't really happen
It's
that
very
much?
strange. On and off, I'll have, literally I'll take a tissue to my forehead and try to wipe it off, and there's literally no water there. The same thing, with my heart, I'll be like, geez, am I sweating? So, I mean, at times, but nothing that profound. And I'm very much grateful for that because, I understand that that's always there, right? That's our true nature. It's not the process of acclimation or becoming something, rather the process of burning away, kind of all the stagnation to get in touch with your true nature. And at different moments in life, I do believe that we're at times meant to be a little bit more connected to the physical, because if we're over there, then what is the point of this? But other times we need that expansiveness to kind of expedite our evolution and awareness, to remind ourselves that we're so much more than this body and, this lifetime and limiting thoughts that we've inherited.
How do you understand those experiences as because I think that there are some people who would experience that as like disassociation or a panic attack, right? I mean, the symptoms that you've sort of described, like the heart racing, the tingling, coming out of your body. So how do you, I mean, I know you experienced it, but I think it's unique to talk to another clinician who's had these experiences. Like,
sure.
how do you sort of differentiate those two?
I would say normally, when we're having all these experiences, there's not the euphoric element of it. And, when you get into the deeper elements of your soul, you have a lot more awareness to what's exactly happening. As it's unfolding, there's that human part that judges and analyzes. And of course, when we get in our own head, we can make mountains out of molehills and look at the world's view, towards the spiritual lens. But I view this world and this reality and the other side as diametrically opposite, where this world is very limited. The other side, there's no limitations. Mm-hmm. And so I would say if it was based off of, negativity, paranoia, demonic kind of thing, then yeah, you kind of worry, by having a psychotic break or, kind of like a schizophrenic episode or something like that. But this was euphoric, and this was, experienced directly, energy that was quite familiar to myself. And so I viewed it as more of a deprogramming and awakening from limitations rather than, something pathologized or just dangerous to myself. I think obviously we could look at it from many different angles, and maybe I'm talking to someone, that's the way they see it, fine. But I say if it's helpful, if it's resourceful, if you're able to integrate it, what's the issue? So.
How did your family respond to this? You come from an Orthodox family, Jewish Orthodox. Did they feel like, oh, this explains him, why? Or was it like, let's not talk about that? Like, what was their response to you coming out with all of this?
I mean, my family is more invested in the here now than the hereafter, so that they're not into the angels and fairies, rainbows kind of thing. They're very much grounded workers, and they're humanitarians and more kind of planted, very grounded in this world, and, intellectual, kind of left-wing kind of people. So, and my father's also a psychotherapist too, but I really separated church and state, no pun intended. I really kept this inside of myself in a sense that intuitively, I think it's very important to, first, timing is everything, and also to be very selective with who and what you share regarding your vulnerability and regarding your experiences. Because if you share it to someone who might put salt on it, you just kind of have like a rainy day or sunshine. And so I had this inner knowing that I didn't necessarily need, a therapist or my parents' approval for. But probably, I would say 2 years ago, bad choice of words, but came out of the NDE, kind of hidden closet. And I just kind of spoke to them matter-of-factly for the first time in over 20 years about it. Just kind of like subtly we'd have conversations about it. And actually, the response was a lot more positive than I thought. And I even ended up learning something that I kind of limited myself in a sense that if you listen to a prior interview that I have, you'll find that I'll say I was 4 or 5 years old when I had my experience, in a sense that I didn't think in my left brain that it was that possible to have those memories at that age or to be able to understand that that was that long ago. And so when my mother told me that it was September of 1993, right before the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, that floored me because in a sense there was, I'm sure, some part of me that knew that. But again, I was judging it, from the human point and said, that must have been 5, 6 years old. I know I was a young kid. And obviously NDE years with time frames were not, like that. So there was a lot to be gained. But after reading the book, I think they were able to understand some of the pieces of just resistance, defiance, opposition, and some of the tantrums and OCD type tendencies that I had. Just this kind of like how this experienced in a good way, set the trajectory of my life, but also I think a part of that, wasn't immune from its challenges of integration.
Yeah, it seems like knowing how expansive and amazing the spiritual world is at the age of 3, and then having to come back into a physical body and live as a human, right? A spiritual being in a human body, knowing that and struggling with what it means to grow up and having had this experience and not have the words to put to that experience. I can understand how that would have really made growing up quite a challenge.
Yeah. Anger, and I talk about this in my book, the first emotion I experienced when I came back to this world, and you could interview my mother and she'll attest this, was intensified anger. I woke up in a hospital bed and it was just such a whirlwind difference of being in the euphoric, other side around, angels and spiritual guides and, soul family, all of that. And then you wake up in this cold hospital bed, with a man trying to work on you. I was so agitated in a sense. It wasn't personal with him, but it was just such a whirlwind change of events so instantly that I had nothing really to do but to just kind of get angry. And so my mother told me that I literally kicked the doctor and ran around the room, and I was just in a fit of rage, in a sense that like you have this experience and you turn down heaven, and then you're put back, in a cold hospital bed in a very vulnerable position. It wasn't Joan and Melissa Rivers interviewing me on the red carpet after that. It was, very vulnerable and just, cold and scary. It was such a transition that I just couldn't express my emotions with. So,
have you met other NDEers who have had early childhood NDEs? Because you're really the first person that
right.
I've come across that's had that. And it just makes me wonder, like you would imagine this isn't something that only happens in adulthood, but that kids don't have the words to understand it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's a little unidimensional with a lot of the people who've had NDEs. I think you'll find that people are working, a lot of times for some reason they're working in media jobs, I find, or just, kind of corporate kind of jobs, and they have this obstruction of consciousness in the shakeup period, and then they can't go back to that intense kind of businessy kind of world, and then that leads itself into a whole other worldview. But kind of like Benjamin Button's my experience, where you have all this wisdom, and then to just integrate when the world's telling you you're growing up, you feel in a way that you're actually shrinking down and losing your true wisdom. So, what people see is evolution. It's almost like a devolution that occurs. But I know I haven't necessarily encountered much. I'm hopeful because I understand coming out of the near-death experience, publicly, there's a lot of cynics and skeptics that come at us. That's just a part of the territory. Now you combine that being an infant. I mean, I get all kinds of stuff coming my way, and I can understand that. When people, have a view of just their body as who they are, I can understand, their point of view, But I think if we view ourselves as eternal, limitless souls, not defined by this body, this time frame, this name, then I think some of those kind of higher viewpoints of consciousness would be able to comprehend it a bit more. But I know there's a lot of research on it. For instance, her name is PMH Atwater. I know she wrote the book, something called Angels or like Little Angels, something like that. But she's a specialist with infant and childhood near-death experiences. I know Raymond's on my cover, and there's a lot of other near-death experience researchers. But PMH Atwater is fantastic. She's written like over 30 books or something, on the topic. But she really, and I met her personally, so she knows about my story, and she's able to certainly validate it through her own research that, yes, indeed, it is possible to have clear recollection of this, not bound by years or time and stuff like that. So, but I haven't had too many interactions with direct infant near-death experiencers, but I'm hoping that my experience empowers others.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense if kids are, sharing their past life experience, past life memories and things like that. You would imagine that maybe more people will start to share their stories if they've had them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's how human nature works. When Kevin Bannister broke the minute mile, more people were just instantaneously able to get under 5 or 6 minutes and do that, as you see that as a possibility. And so, I think it takes great vulnerability, and strength to come out. But the more that you do that, the more that others will be able to come out. I mean, my goal is for not people to be attached to my near-death experience or my story, but rather to empower it to their own stories. Because I don't see myself as anything different other than just a kid who's suffocated and, has more recollection, and maybe more pros and cons with that. But I think in a way, we all come from that place. We all go to that place. No one has a monopolization of that. And the more that people are able to take ownership and empowerment of their own consciousness, I think the more symmetry we'll have between that side and this side.
Has your dad ever had anybody in his practice that experienced this? Do you know?
Not really, but it's funny. I was, a couple of years ago, when I got my near-death experience, I was looking, because I'm a therapist and I want to be able to understand this from a medical, psychological perspective. It gave me a lot more confidence to go in publicly, especially given the vantage point and how people try to, say those got you kind of questions and stuff like that. That's all part of it. But I was reading a book by Dr. Kenneth Ring. It's called Lessons from the Light. My dad looks at it. He goes, Kenneth Ring. I go, yeah, what about him? You know him? And he goes, yes, he was my psychology professor at the University of Connecticut, I don't want to give his wage, but, over 30, 40 years ago. And so at the time, Kenneth wasn't like this big NDE star. He was just, typical professor in Stores, Connecticut, whatever. And so, that was kind of like a funny experience where he's like, Dr. Kenneth Ring, like, I know him. He was my psychology professor.
Right. And
But
now he's one of the top people in NDE research.
yeah, no, he's a legend and an icon in our community. I know Laura Lynn Jackson talks about him in her book. What's her first book's name?
The light.
The one, the light between, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she mentions a reading that she had on Dr. Kenneth Ring, and she was able to read his auric field, and everything around him was quite profound. I actually contacted her after. I know she's an alumni of your show too.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't been able to get in touch with him, but I'm trying to find a way. So I think he'd be pretty blown away by that. But my father more specializes in the higher autism spectrum. So he works mostly with, kids, families with their defined autistic kind of ADHD tendencies. I'm not, on the spectrum, but I'm sure, my defined behaviors might have kind of swayed him in the way where he had that kind of direct experiences to be able to help out others. So, and my mother's more in early childhood intervention. So it's funny how both my parents kind of specialize, in the years where I was most difficult in. But I give them a run for my money. There's no question about it.
So before we wrap up today, what does your clinical work look like having had this experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I try to be a good social worker. That's my hat that I wear. And part of that is understanding and integrating social work principles. And I know social work psychology under APA, American Psychological Association, but really our job is to meet the client where they're at, not to enforce belief systems, and to be able to hold space in an objective, kind of manner. And so I do get referrals, a lot more regularly. Obviously, it's since my book came out, with people who have had these experiences and they just don't know what to do with them. They're feeling depressed, borderline suicidal ideation, stuff like that. And so I work with those kind of clients. But within my own line of practice, I work, full-time in a mental health clinic, kind of like in a dual mental health as well as recovery-oriented setting for clients, with addictive patterns and stuff like that. It's mostly kind of adults, but I'm able to integrate some of these practices indirectly. Like I was running around 3 to 4 mindfulness groups per week within my clinic. And my clinic is, I could say it's a bit of a Medicaid mill like other clinics too. And so, we tend to track all populations, but largely a lot of it is a lower socioeconomic, kind of population and clientele that comes our way. And so I noticed kind of like a disadvantage perspective with people who had resources and finances to be able to attend these fancy, nice seminars, and that's great. But I noticed kind of a disadvantage just in terms of accessibility, to healing modalities. And so I took that upon myself to run, several mindfulness meditation workshops per week. And I guess my near-death experience has really influenced me to be there for the little guy as much as I could, which kind of like speaks to other previous lifetimes, but that's just the one that I'm most passionate about. The one who's facing a lot of socioeconomic challenges and, feeling uncertain and just kind of like the back is against the wall. And, those type of clients, I think, tend to do well, with more of just talk therapy. I think they're looking more for resources and tools, to be able to mitigate and manage the challenges and cumulative disadvantages that they face day to day. So I do that as well as privately, past life regression and hypnosis. And I really do that because, and I speak about this in my book, I had not just in my NDE, memories of it, but also throughout childhood, I had a lot of traumatic past life experiences that I remembered that kept on kind of haunting me, and I had no idea. Sometimes it was dreams, sometimes it was an awakened state. And so what I wanted to do is to empower people to really be able to understand that not only are we infinite beings, but we have infinite amount of lifetimes. And I think part of it is, being able to understand our books, not just by looking on the page that we stepped into, by understanding prior chapters. So the greater messages are no longer needed to be repeated as the lessons are integrated and embraced. And so I think I try to expedite people's evolution within this lifetime so that you don't have to wait 50, 60 years to die to have clarity, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, Jacob, thank you so much for your time today and your flexibility, because we moved this around a lot. So I appreciate that. Where can people find more information about you and your book?
Yeah, so if people are interested in learning more about me, services through past life regression, hypnosis, or if you're in New York State, psychotherapy session, you could look at my website, and my book is there too at jacoblcooper.com. It's jacoblcooper.com, and there you could look at my book too. There's a whole section of life after breath for those of you interested, as well as I have monthly Facebook groups open to the community with different topics. So they're usually at the last Monday of each month. This time it's going to be February 22nd at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the topic that I'm having is kind of owning your inspired story in a way, and kind of helping people to really take ownership of their stories. It doesn't necessarily mean that you write a book. You could be a blog, but being able to not be defined by your story, but rather to integrate it, in a way, and take ownership of it. So not define your story, not be defined by, but to define. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
That's open to the public. Facebook Lives at Jacob Cooper LCSW, where we have different topics all related to higher consciousness, healing, in a different uplifting, inspirational topics for the public to attend. So.
Well, thank you again for your time today and for sharing your remarkable experience with us.
Thank you, Dr. Amy. I really appreciate being an honored guest in your program, and hope some of this was helpful for listeners across.
I know it always is. It always resonates with people. So Thank you.
Thank you.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.